Chapter 8, Vital Villages, Thriving Towns. Prabhakar at the blacksmith's shop. Prabhakar sat watching the smith at the local shop. There was a small bench on which iron tools like axes and sickles were laid out, ready for sale. A bright fire was burning, and two men were heating and beating metal rods into shape. It was very hot and noisy, and yet it was fascinating to watch what was happening. Iron tools and agriculture. We often take the use of iron for granted today. Things made of iron and steel are a part of our daily lives. The use of iron began in the subcontinent around 3000 years ago. Some of the largest collections of iron tools and weapons were found in the megalith burials, about which you read in chapter 4. Around 2500 years ago, there is evidence for the growing use of iron tool. These included access for clearing forests and the iron plowshare. As we had seen chapter 5, the plowshare was useful for increasing agricultural production. Other steps to increase production: irrigation. The kings and kingdoms you have been reading about could not have existed without the support of flourishing villages, while new tools and the system of transplantation, chapter 5, increased production. Irrigation was also used. Irrigation works that were built during this time included canals, wells, tanks, and artificial lakes. If you look at the chart, you will find that some of the stages in the construction of irrigation works are mentioned. Who lived in the villages? There were at least three different kinds of people living in most villages in the southern and northern parts of the subcontinent. In the Tamil region, large landowners were known as Vellalar, ordinary plowmen were known as Uzavar, and landless laborers, including slaves, were known as Kadaisiar and Adiyami. In the northern part of the country, the village headman was known as the Grama Bojaka. Usually, men from the same family held the position for generations. In other words, the post was hereditary. The Grama Bojaka was often the largest landowner. Generally, he had slaves and hired workers to cultivate the land. Besides, as he was powerful, the king often used him to collect taxes from the village. He also functioned as a judge and sometimes as a policeman. Apart from the Gram Bhojaka, there were other independent farmers known as Grihapatis, most of whom were smaller landowners. And then there were men and women such as the Dasa Karmakara who did not own land and had to earn a living working on the fields owned by others. In most villages, there were also some craftspersons such as the blacksmith, potter, carpenter, and weaver. The earliest Tamil compositions. Some of the earliest works in Tamil, known as Sangam literature, were composed around 2300 years ago. These texts were called Sangam because they were supposed to have been composed and compiled by in assemblies known as Sangams of poets that were held in the city of Madurai. See map 7 page 105. The Tamil terms mentioned above are found in Sangam literature. Finding out about cities, stories, travelers, sculpture, and archaeology. You may have heard of the Jatakas. These were stories that were probably composed by ordinary people and then written down and preserved by Buddhist monks. Here is a part of a Jataka story which tells us how a poor man gradually became rich. We can use other kinds of evidence to find out about life in some of these early cities. Sculptures carved scenes depicting people live in towns and villages as well as in the forest. Many of these sculptures were used to decorate railings, pillars, and gateways of buildings that were visited by people. Many of the cities that developed from about 2500 years ago were capitals of the Mahajanapadas that you learned about in chapter 5. As we had seen, some of these cities were surrounded by massive fortification walls. In many cities, archaeologists have found rows of pots or ceramic rings arranged one on top of the other. These are known as ring wells. These seem to have been used as toilets in some cases and as drains and garbage dumps. These ring wells are usually found in individual houses. We have hardly any remains of palaces, markets, or of homes of ordinary people. Perhaps some are yet to be discovered by archaeologists. Others, made of wood, mud brick, and thatched, may not have survived. Another way of finding out about early cities is from the accounts of sailors and travelers who visited them. One of the most detailed accounts that has been found was by an unknown Greek sailor. He described all the ports he visited. Find Bharuch on map 7, page 105, and then read his description of the city. Coins. You may have noticed how wealth is measured in terms of coins. In the story on page 82, archaeologists have found several thousand of coins belonging to this period. The earliest coins, which were in use for about 500 years, were punch marked coins such as the one shown below. Cities with many functions. Very often, a single town was important for a variety of reasons. Let us look at the example of Mathura. Mathura has been an important settlement for more than 2500 years. It was important because it was located at the crossroads of two major routes of travel and trade, from the northwest to the east and from north to south. There were fortifications around the city and several shrines. Farmers and herders from adjoining areas provided food for people in the city. Mathura was also a center where some extremely fine sculpture was produced. Around 2000 years ago, Mathura became the second capital of the Kushanas, about whom you will be reading in chapter 9. Mathura was also a religious center. There were Buddhist monasteries, Jaina shrines, and it was an important center for the worship of Krishna. Several inscriptions on surfaces, such as stone slabs and statues, have been found in Mathura. Generally, these are short inscriptions recording gifts made by men and sometimes women to monasteries and shrines. These were made by kings and queens, officers, merchants, and crafts persons who lived in the city. For instance, inscriptions from Mathura mention goldsmiths, blacksmiths, weavers, basket makers, grand garland makers, perfumes. Make a list of the occupation of people who lived in Mathura. List one occupation that was not practiced in Harappan cities. Crafts and craftspersons. We also have archaeological evidence for crafts. These include extremely fine pottery known as the northern black polished ware. It gets its name from the fact that it is generally found in the northern part of the subcontinent. Remember that the archaeological evidence for many crafts may not have survived. We know from texts that the manufacture of cloth was important. There were famous centers such as Varanasi in the north and Madurai in the south. Both men and women worked in these centers. Many craftspersons and merchants now formed associations known as shrenis. These shrenis of craftspersons provided training, procured raw material, and distributed the finished product. Then, shrenis or merchants organized the trade. Shrenis also served as banks where rich men and women deposited money. This was invested, and part of the interest was returned or used to support religious institutions such as monasteries. A closer look. Arikamedu. Find Arikamedu in Puducherry on map 7, page 105, and read the box on Rome on page 88. Between 2200 and 1900 years ago, Arikamedu was a coastal settlement where ships unloaded goods from distant lands. A massive brick structure, which may have been a warehouse, was found at the site. Other finds include pottery from the Mediterranean regions, such as amphorae, tall double-handled jars that contain liquids such as wine or oil, and stamped red glazed pottery known as Aretian ware, which was named after a city in Italy. This was made by pressing wet clay into a stamped mold. There was yet another kind of pottery which was made locally, though Roman designs were used. Roman lamps, glassware, and gems have also been found at the site. Small tanks have been found that were probably dyeing vats used to dye cloth. There is plenty of evidence for the making of beads from semi precious stones and glass. List the evidence that indicates that there was contact with Rome.